Alright guys, The Painted Bird, Chapter 9. I wandered for several days in the woods and made attempts to approach the villages. The first time I noticed people running from one house to another, shouting and waving their arms. I did not know what had happened, but it seemed wiser to stay away. In the next village I heard shots, which meant that either partisans or Germans were nearby. Discouraged, I continued on my trek for another 2 days. Finally, hungry and exhausted, I decided to try the next village, which seemed quiet enough from the edge of the forest. As I emerged from the bushes, I nearly walked into a man plowing a small field. He was a giant with enormous hands and feet. Reddish whiskers covered his face, almost up to the eyes, and his long, disheveled hair stood up like a tangle of reeds. His pale gray eyes watched me warily, trying to imitate the local dialect. I told him that for a place to sleep and a little food, I would milk his cows, clean the stable, take the beast to pasture, chop wood, set snares for game, and cast spells of all kinds against human and animal ills. The peasant listened carefully, examined me, and then took me home without saying a word. He had no children. His wife, after arguing with some neighbors, agreed to take me in. I was shown a sleeping place in the stable and told my duties. The village was poor. The huts were built of logs plastered on both sides with clay and straw. The walls were sunk deeply in the ground and supported thatched roofs crowned with chimneys made of willow and clay. Only a few of the peasants had barns, and these were often built back to save one wall. Now and then some German soldiers from a nearby railroad station came to the village to take any food they could find. When the Germans were approaching and it was too late to run for the woods, my master hid me in a skillfully camouflaged cellar beneath the barn. Its entrance was very narrow, and it was at least 10 feet deep. I had helped dig it myself, and no one else other than the man and his wife knew of its existence. It had a well-stocked larder with large lumps of butter and cheese, smoked hams, rings of sausage, bottles of homemade liquor, and other delicacies. The bottom of the cellar was always cool. While the Germans rushed all over the house searching for food, chasing pigs in the fields, clumsily trying to catch chickens, I sat there absorbing the delicious fragrances. Sometimes they stood on the board covering the entrance to the cellar. I used to hold my nose to avoid sneezing as I listened to their strange speech. As soon as the sound of the army trucks died in the distance, the man would pull me up out of the cellar to resume my usual duties. The mushroom season had begun. The hungry villagers welcomed it and went into the woods for the rich harvest. Every hand was needed, and my master always took me along. Large parties of peasants from other villages roamed the woods in search of the small growths. My master realized that I looked like a gypsy, and anxious not to be denounced to the Germans, he shaved my black hair. When going out, I put a large old cap on my head that covered half my face and made me less conspicuous. Still, I felt uneasy under the suspicious glances of the other peasants, so I tried always to stay close to my master. I felt that I was sufficiently useful to him to be kept for a while. On the way to the mushroom gathering, we crossed the railroad running through the forest. Several times a day, great puffing locomotives passed, pulling long freight trains. Machine guns thrust out of the roofs of the cars and rested on a platform in front of the steam engine. Helmeted soldiers scanned the sky and woods with binoculars. Then a new kind of train appeared on the line. Living people were jammed in locked cattle cars. Some of the men who worked at the station brought news to the village. These trains carried Jews and gypsies who had been captured and sentenced to death. In each car there were 200 of them stacked like corn stalks, arms raised to take up less space. Old and young men, women and children, even babies. Some of the peasants from the neighboring village were temporarily employed on the construction of a concentration camp and brought back strange tales. They told us that after leaving the train, the Jews were sorted into different groups and stripped naked and deprived of all their possessions. Their hair was cut off, apparently for use in mattresses. The Germans also looked at their teeth, and if there were any gold ones, they were immediately pulled out. The gas chambers and ovens could not cope with the great supply of people. Many of those killed by gas were not burned, but simply buried in pits around the camp. The peasants listened to these stories thoughtfully. They said the Lord's punishment had finally reached the Jews. They had deserved it long ago, ever since the crucified Christ. God never forgot. If he had overlooked the sins of the Jews so far, he had not forgiven them. Now the Lord was using the Germans as his instrument of justice. The Jews were to be denied the privilege of a natural death. They had to perish by fire, suffering the torments of hell here on earth. They were being justly punished for the shameful crimes of their ancestors, for refuting the only true faith, for mercilessly killing Christian babies and drinking their blood. The villagers now gave me even darker looks. "You gypsy Jew," they yelled. "You'll burn yet, bastard, you will." I pretended that this did not concern me, even when some shepherds caught me and tried to drag me to a fire and toast my heels, as was God's will. I struggled, scratching and biting them. I had no intention of being burned in such an ordinary campfire when others were incinerated in special and elaborate furnaces built by the Germans and equipped with engines more powerful than those of the largest locomotives. I stayed awake at night worrying whether God would punish me too. My parents always went to church on Sundays and sometimes even took me and my nurse. Was it possible that God's wrath was reserved only for people with black hair and eyes who were called gypsies? Why did my father, whom I still remembered well, have fair hair and blue eyes while my mother was dark? What was the difference between a gypsy and a Jew, since both were dusky and both were destined for the same end? Probably after the war, only fair-haired, blue-eyed people would be left in the world. Then what would happen to children of blonde people who might be born dark? When the trains carrying Jews went by in the daytime or at dusk, the peasants lined up on both sides of the track and waved cheerfully to the engineer, the stoker, and the few guards. Through the small square windows at the top of the locked cars, one could sometimes glimpse a human face. These people must have climbed on the shoulders of others to see where they were going and to find out whose voices they heard outside. Seeing the friendly gestures of the peasants, the people in the car must have thought that they themselves were being greeted. Then the Jewish faces would disappear and a mass of thin, pale arms would wave desperate signals. The peasants watched the trains with curiosity, listening intently to the strange humming sound of the human throng. Neither groan, cry, nor song. The train went by, and as it pulled away, one could still see against the dark background of the forest disembodied human arms waving tirelessly from the windows. Sometimes at night, people traveling to the crematories would toss their small children through the windows in the hope of saving their lives. Now and then they managed to wrench up the floorboards, and a determined Jew might force his way through the hole, hitting the crushed stone track, the rails, or the taut semaphore wire. Slashed by the wheels, their mutilated trunks rolled down the embankment into the tall grass. Peasants wandering along the tracks in daytime would find these remains and quickly strip them of clothes and shoes. Gingerly, lest they get soiled with the diseased blood of the unbaptized, they ripped the lining off the victims' clothes and searched for valuables. There were many disputes and fights over the loot. Later, the stripped bodies were left on the track between the rails, where they were found by the German motorized patrol car which passed once a day. The Germans either poured gasoline over the contaminated bodies and burned them on the spot or buried them nearby. One day word came to the village that several trains which Jews had passed that night, one after another. The peasants finished their mushroom gathering earlier than usual, and then we all went to the railroad tracks. We walked along the line on both sides in single file, peering into the bushes, looking for signs of blood on the signal pole wires and on the edge of the embankment. There was nothing for a few miles, then one of the women spotted some crushed branches in a thicket of wild roses. Someone spread the thorny growth, and we saw a small boy of about 5 sprawled on the ground. His shirt and pants were in shreds, his black hair was long, and his dark eyebrows arched. He seemed to be asleep or dead. One of the men stepped on his leg. The boy jerked and opened his eyes. Seeing people leaning over him, he tried to say something, but pink froth came from his mouth instead and dripped slowly over his chin and neck. Afraid of his black eyes, the peasants quickly moved aside and crossed themselves before he could have time to count their teeth. Hearing voices behind him, the boy tried to turn over, but his bones must have been broken because he only moaned and a large bloody bubble appeared at his mouth. He fell back and closed his eyes. The peasants watched him suspiciously from a distance. One of the women crept forward, grabbed the worn shoes on his feet, and tore them off. The boy moved, groaned, and coughed up more blood. He opened his eyes and saw the peasants who darted out of his field of vision, crossing themselves in panic. He closed his eyes again and remained motionless. 2 men grabbed him by the legs and turned him over. He was dead. They took off his jacket, shirt, and shorts and carried him to the middle of the track. He was quite visible, and the German patrol car could not miss him. We turned to go home. I glanced back as he went. The boy was lying on the whitish stones of the track. Only the clump of his black hair remained in view. I tried to think what he had thought before dying. When he was tossed out of the train, his parents or his friends no doubt assured him that he would find human help which would save him from a horrible death in the great furnace. He probably felt cheated, deceived. He would have preferred to cling to the warm bodies of his father and mother in the packed car, to feel the pressure and smell the hot, tart odors, the presence of other people, knowing that he was not alone, assured by everyone that it was all only a misunderstanding. Although I regretted the boy's tragedy, at the bottom of my mind lurked a feeling of relief that he was dead. Keeping him in the village would do no one any good, I thought. He would threaten the lives of all of us. If the Germans heard about a Jewish foundling, they would converge on the village. They would search every house. They would find the boy, and they would also find me in my cellar. They would probably assume that I too had fallen off the train and would kill both of us together on the spot, punishing the whole village later. I pulled the cloth cap over my face, dragging my feet at the end of the line. Wouldn't it be easier to change people's eyes and hair than to build big furnaces and then catch Jews and gypsies to burn in them? Mushroom gathering was now a daily chore. Baskets of them were drying everywhere. Basketfuls were hidden in lofts and barns. More and more grew in the woods. Every morning people dispersed into the forest with empty baskets. Heavily laden bees carrying nectar from dying flowers droned lazily in the autumn sun through the windless peace of the thick undergrowth guarded by the towers of tall trees. Bending down to pick the mushrooms, people called to each other in cheerful voices each time they found a rich cluster. They were answered by the soft cacophony of birds calling from the thickets of hazel and juniper, from the branches of oaks and hornbeams. Sometimes the sinister cry of an owl was heard, but no one could see it in its deep hidden hole in some tree trunk. A reddish fox might scurry away into the dense bushes after a feast of partridge eggs. Vipers would crawl nervously, hissing to give themselves courage. A fat hare would bound into the bush with huge leaps. The symphony of the forest was broken only by the puffing of a locomotive, the rattle of cars, the grinding of the brakes. People stood still, looking toward the tracks. The birds grew silent. The owl drew deeper into his hole, draping his gray cloak about himself with dignity. The hare stood up, raising his long ears high, and then, reassured, resumed his leaps. In the weeks that followed until the mushroom season ended, we often walked along the railroad tracks. Occasionally we passed small oblong heaps of black ashes and some charred bones, broken and trodden into the gravel. With pursed lips, the men stopped and stared. Some people feared that even the burnt corpses of those jumping off the train might contaminate both men and animals, and they would hastily kick dirt over the ashes. Once I pretended to pick up a mushroom which had dropped out of my basket and grasped a handful of this human dust. It stuck to my fingers and smelled of gasoline. I looked at it closely but could find no trace of a person. Yet this ash was not like the ash left in kitchen ovens where wood, dried peat, and moss were burned. I became frightened. It seemed to me as I rubbed the handful of ash in my fingers that the ghost of the burned person hovered over me, watching and remembering all of us. I knew that the ghost might never leave me, that it might follow me, haunt me at night, seep sickness into my veins and madness into my brain. After each train had passed, I saw whole battalions of ghosts with evil, vengeful faces coming into the world. The peasants said the smoke from the crematories went straight to heaven, laying a soft carpet at God's feet without even soiling them. I wonder whether so many Jews were necessary to compensate God for the killing of his son. Perhaps the world would soon become one vast incinerator for burning people. Had not the priest said that all were doomed to perish, to go from ashes to ashes? Along the embankment between the rails, we found innumerable scraps of paper, notebooks, calendars, family photographs, printed personal documents, old passports, and diaries. The pictures were, of course, the most desirable to collect, since no one in the village could read. In some of the pictures, elderly people in peculiar clothes sat stiffly, and others, elegantly dressed parents, stood with their arms on the shoulders of their children, all smiling and wearing clothing of a type that no one in the village had ever seen. Sometimes we found photographs of beautiful young girls, prettier than angels in church, or bearded men with piercing black eyes. There were pictures of old men who looked like apostles and old ladies with faded smiles, and someone could see children playing in a park, babies crying, or newlyweds kissing. On the reverse of these were some scribbled farewells, oaths, or religious passages in hands obviously shaken by fear or the motion of the train. The words were often washed off by the morning dew or bleached out by the sun. The peasants eagerly collected these articles. The women giggled and whispered to one another about the pictures of the men, while the men muttered obscene jokes and comments about the pictures of the girls. People in the village collected these photographs, traded them, and hung them in their huts and barns. In some houses there was a picture of Our Lady on one wall, of Christ on another, a crucifix on the third, and pictures of numerous Jews on the fourth. Farmers would come upon their hired hands exchanging pictures of girls, staring excitedly at them and playing indecently with each other. And it was said that one of the more attractive village girls fell so hopelessly in love with the handsome man in a photograph that she would not look at her fiancé afterwards. One day a boy brought back news from the mushroom fields of a Jewish girl found by the railroad tracks. She was alive with only a sprained shoulder and some bruises. They surmised that she had dropped through a hole in the floor when the train slowed down on a curve and thus escaped more serious injuries. Everyone turned out to see this marvel. The girl staggered along, half carried by some men. Her thin face was very pale. She had thick eyebrows and very black eyes. Her long, glossy black hair was tied with a ribbon and fell down her back. Her dress was torn, and I could see bruises, scratches on her white body. With her good arm, she tried to hold up the injured one. The men took her to the house of the village head. A curious crowd assembled, looking her over carefully. She did not seem to understand anything. Whenever any of the men came near her, she joined her hands as though in prayer and babbled in a language no one could understand. Terrified, she stared about her with eyes that had blue-white eyeballs and jet-black pupils. The village headman conferred with some of the elders of the village and also with Rainbow. the man who had found the Jewess. It was decided that in accordance with official regulations, she would be sent to the German post the next day. The peasants slowly dispersed to their homes, but some of the bolder ones stayed on, watching the girl and cracking jokes. Half-blind old women spat thrice in her direction and, muttering under their breath, warned their grandsons. The rainbow took the girl by the arm and led her to his hut. Though some thought him odd, he was well liked in the village. He took special interest in heavenly signs, especially rainbows, hence his nickname. In the evenings when he entertained his neighbors, he could talk for hours about rainbows. Listening to him from a dark corner, I learned that a rainbow was a long arched stalk, hollow as a straw. One end is immersed in a river or lake, the other end draws the water, which is then distributed fairly over the countryside. Fishes and other creatures are drawn up with the water, and that is why one finds the same kind of fish in widely separated lakes, ponds, and rivers. Rainbow's hut adjoined my master's. His barn shared a wall with the barn in which I slept. His wife had died some time ago, but Rainbow, still young, could not decide on another mate. His neighbors used to say that those who stared at rainbows too much cannot see an ass in front of their faces. An old woman cooked for Rainbow and looked after his children while he worked in the fields and got drunk once in a while for recreation. The Jewess was to spend the night at Rainbow's home. That evening I was awakened by noises and cries from his barn. At first I was scared, but I found a knothole through which I could see what was happening. In the middle of the cleaned threshing floor, the girl was lying on some sacks. Next to her, an oil lamp was burning on an old chopping block. Rainbow sat close to her head. Neither moved. Then Rainbow, with a quick movement, pulled the dress off the girl's shoulders. The strap gave way. The girl tried to escape, but Rainbow kneeled on her long hair and held her face between his knees. He leaned closer, then he tore the other strap off. The girl cried but remained motionless. Rainbow crawled to her feet. Rainbow crawled to her feet, wedging them between his legs, and with a deft jerk pulled off her dress. She tried to rise and hold on to the material with her good hand, but Rainbow pushed her back. She was now naked. The flickering light of the oil lamp threw shadows on her pulsing breasts. Rainbow sat at the girl's side and stroked her body with his big hands. His bulk hid her face from me, but I could hear her quiet sobbing, broken occasionally by a cry. Slowly Rainbow took off his knee boots and breeches, leaving on only a rough shirt. He straddled the prostrate girl. She moaned and whined, uttering strange words in her language when his touch grew rougher. Rainbow breathed heavily. He lifted himself on his elbows, slipped down a little, and then with one brutal push, fell on her with a thud. The girl arched her body, screamed, and kept opening and closing her fingers as though trying to grasp something. Then something strange happened. Rainbow was on top of the girl, his legs between hers, but trying to break away. Every time he lifted himself, she screamed with pain. He also groaned and cursed. He was held fast by some strange force inside her, just as a hare or fox is caught in a snare. He remained on top of the girl, trembling violently. After a while, he renewed his efforts, but each time the girl writhed in pain. He also seemed to suffer. He wiped the perspiration off his face, swore, and spat. At his next try, the girl wanted to help. She opened her legs wider, lifted her hips, and pushed with her good hand against his belly. It was all in vain. An invisible bond held them together. I'd often seen this same thing happen to dogs. Sometimes when they coupled violently, starved for release, they could not break loose again. They seemed to be one body with two heads and two tails growing in the same place. From man's friend, they became nature's practical joke. They howled, yelped, and shook all over. Their bloodshot eyes, begging for help, gaped with unspeakable agony at the people hitting them with rakes and sticks. Rolling in the dust and bleeding under the blows, they redoubled their efforts to break apart. People laughed, kicked the dogs, threw screeching cats and rocks at them. The animals tried to run away, but each headed in the opposite direction. They ran in circles. In mad rage, they tried to bite each other. Finally, they gave up and waited for human help. Some village boys would throw them into a river or pond. They tried desperately to swim, but each kept pulling away from the other. They were helpless, and their heads only emerged from time to time, frothing at the mouth, too weak to bark. As the current carried them away, an amused crowd followed along the riverbank, shouting with joy, throwing stones at their heads as they bobbed out of the water. Rainbow renewed his efforts. He appealed loudly to the Virgin Mary for help. He panted and puffed. He made another big heave, trying to tear himself away from the girl. She screamed and started to hit the bewildered man's face with her fist, scratch him with her nails, bite his hands. Rainbow licked the blood off his lip, lifted himself on one arm, and dealt the girl a powerful blow with the other. Panic must have dimmed his brain, for he collapsed on top of her, biting her breast, arms, and neck. The girl screamed with a high-pitched, steady cry that finally broke off when her throat dried up, and then it started again. Rainbow went on, beating her until he was exhausted. They lay one on top of the other, motionless and silent. The flickering flame of the oil lamp was the only thing that moved. Rainbow started crying for help. His shouts brought first a band of barking dogs and some alarmed men with axes and knives. They opened the door of the barn and, uncomprehending, goggled at the couple on the floor. In a hoarse voice, Rainbow quickly explained the situation. They closed the door and, not letting anyone else enter, sent for a witch midwife who knew about such things. The old woman came, kneeled by the locked couple, and did something to them with the help of others. I could see nothing. I only heard the girl's last piercing shriek. Then there was silence, and Rainbow's barn grew dark. At dawn, I ran to the knothole. Sunshine was coming in through the slots between the boards, lighting up sparkling beams of grain dust. On the threshing floor close to the wall, a human shape lay stretched out flat, covered from head to foot with a horse blanket. I had to take the cows to pasture while the village was still asleep. When I returned at dusk, I heard the peasants discussing the previous night's events. Rainbow had taken the body back to the railroad track where the patrol was due to pass in the morning. For several weeks, the village had a lively topic of conversation. Rainbow himself, when he had a few drinks, would tell people how the Jewish had sucked him in and wouldn't let him go, or wouldn't let go of him. Strange dreams haunted me at night. I heard moans and cries in the barn. An icy hand touched me. Black strands of lank hair smelling of gasoline stroked my face. At dawn, when I took the cattle to pasture, I looked fearfully at the mists floating over the fields. Sometimes the wind would push along a tiny shred of soot, clearly heading in my direction. I shivered and cold sweat poured down my back. The bit of soot circled over my head, looking me straight in the eye, and then drifted high into heaven to the feet of God himself. I don't know, they killed the girl? I'm not sure what happened. Guys. As you guys notice, every chapter is a fucking tragedy. Every chapter is some scandalous shit, you know? I don't know. I'm fucking tired.